Hi there, my name is Gary Friedman, and welcome to the Secrets of the Kodachrome Shooters, where I single-handedly try to dispel all of the myths that are out there regarding what you really need in order to take wow-type images. I'll give you a hint, it doesn't require an expensive camera, and you don't have to spend your life learning Photoshop. How do I know this? Once upon a time, professional photographers only shot with slides. Back in the day, there was no such thing as autofocus, no auto white balance, no RAW, and certainly no Photoshop. And you know what? All the principles that worked back then still apply today, whether you're shooting with an expensive camera or just your smartphone. So, without further ado, sit back, get some popcorn, snuggle up with a blanket, and drink in the knowledge that nobody seems to talk about anymore. By the time this video is done, people will be asking you the question that every photographer hates. Gee, those are great pictures. What kind of camera do you have? Let's watch.
Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Friedman.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the old school of photography. I went through it. You will too. And this weekend we're going to talk about the entire history of art. And we're going to talk about color theory, the zone system, and which is bigger, medium format or large format. We're going to talk about the chemistry of developing, and we're going to talk about exposing for the shadows and developing for the highlights. If you ever thought that you enjoyed photography before, we're going to put a stop to that right now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Gary Friedman, and welcome to the Friedman Archive Seminars. As you know, many of you are here because you don't want to learn the old school of photography like I had to endure. Actually, many of you now have point and shoots, and the point and shoots can do amazing things. They can focus for you, they can do the exposure for you, they can white balance for you, and yet you'd figure that the learning curve for digital imaging would be so short, you point and shoot, right? No. This is the new learning curve for digital photography. Technology has not made it any easier, or so you would think. If you ever picked yourself up a book of digital photography, or went to any of the famous online discussion forums where people talk about what's important in photography, you'll see all these things. Histograms, white balance, RAW versus JPEG, compression artifacts, HDR, things like that. Is any of this stuff absolutely necessary in order to get wow-type pictures that the National Geographic photographers use? The answer is no. And to prove it to you, let me pass around a couple things which were taken with an old-fashioned camera. Now, for those of you on Twitter, these are called slides. Have a look at this. Have a look at these. Slides were very unique. If you were a working professional, you always shot slides because that's what the printing houses demanded. Slides are the very same film that you put in your camera. You expose it, you develop it, and you take that film, you chop it up with scissors, and you put it in a slide mount. There is no post-processing, there's no Photoshop, there's no HDR. You either got the light right or you didn't. You either had the exposure for that light right or you didn't. And if you wanted to be a working pro, you had to understand the elements of light and composition in order to be able to make a living shooting stock photography on slides. Are you impressed by these pictures?
Yes.
These were shot with a camera like this. Manual focus, film. So if someone shows you slides with no Photoshop, no HDR, no shooting RAW, no Lightroom, and you can look at those pictures and say, wow, what does that tell you about all the current thinking about what's actually important in photography?
It's not that important.
Not that important. Now, I have to watch what I say now. It does come up if you're taking an advanced class. Let's say you're a graduate student in photography. Then these things are important. But unless you have your light and composition right, none of these things matter. And I guarantee you, I've never seen any beginner start to shoot in RAW, and then suddenly his images are, oh my gosh, wow. Something else is at work. Today we're going to learn about the secrets of the Kodachrome shooters that nobody seems to be talking about anymore. We're going to talk about how you can get great pictures using the camera you already have, using the same techniques that we did back in my day. Light and composition. The high impact approach is probably different from any other photo course you've ever taken. My approach is cameras can do a great job on their own. They can focus for you. They can do all the technical stuff for you. The only thing they cannot do for you is compose for you. They can't make sure the light's good. I mean, they can try to adapt, but they can only go so far. So we're going to talk about the history of art, which is going to be important. We're going to talk about what you can do to get great shots with the camera you have, and learning how to see light is the single most important thing you can do in that case. Before we continue, it makes sense for me to give some credentials. I'm a stock photographer. I'm also an author of a few books. I run the website friedmanarchives.com, and I license my images to book and magazine editors all around the world. And in case you haven't had the chance to go look, you can go to friedmanarchives.com. Here's the website. And you can feel free to peruse some of the images. There's some ads for books. You can ignore those for today. And just pick any category at all. Here's one for California. Pick any category at all and start to browse, and you can click on some and get enlargements. But the important thing I want you to see today, not only is every technique I'm going to teach you today is evident in these. You can actually, after today is over, we can break down any one of those and say, okay, what technique did I use here? What technique did I use here? You can teach photography. Unlike any other art, you can't teach opera, you can't teach ballet. You either have a gift or you don't. Photography is one of the rare arts where you actually can teach it mostly, to a great degree. So anybody can do it. And if you find a picture you like, you just click on it. And it's not showing here because I'm not online, but between the title and the picture, there's usually an ad in there. Click on the ad. I get 3.5 cents every time somebody clicks on an ad. In addition to that, I've also written some books, which is probably one of the reasons you're all here, books on digital imaging. Yes, it's kind of complicated and intimidating at first, but my books are renowned for being very easy to understand and approach, and I try to emphasize, here's what's really important. This feature is marginally useful under these circumstances, and you can probably ignore it if you want to. If your light and composition aren't good, none of these fancy features are going to matter. Your Zeiss glass isn't going to matter. So let me start now with the most important thing I'm going to mention today. These are all great photographs. These are all great pictures. And if you don't believe me, ask the grandmother whose mantle these pictures are sitting on. She's going to look at them and say, oh, I remember that trip back east, 1962 was the last one. It was taken with an Instamatic on the left. It doesn't matter how good or how bad the pictures is, it's going to jog a neuron. And if it jogs a memory, a positive memory in the eye of the viewer, then that snapshot has done its job as a memory jog. Other people who are not on that trip, who didn't experience the same thing, will look at the picture and not be impressed at all. But to the grandmother, these are priceless. And it's an important thing to bring up because there tends to be so much arrogance regarding photographers. You know, that's an awful picture. The light's bad. The exposure's bad. Can't see, it's poorly composed, blah, 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 blah. No, they're great pictures because a snapshot is designed to jog the memory of the viewer, nothing else. If you want to impress a third party who wasn't there, then you start to have the rules of composition, the rules of light, and all those other things that were borrowed from the world of art. That will impress other folks who weren't there at the time, who don't have the shared mechanism. So now I'm going to do what I'm going to be doing throughout most of the weekend. I'm going to say something and I'm going to reinforce it with the slides, not because I like redundancy, but because these handouts that you have are designed for you to go and through it a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now, a year, 2 years, 4 years, 8 years. If you reinforce the idea at regular extended intervals, it'll go from short-term memory to long-term memory. So these things are here for you whenever you're going over the handouts in the future. And let me just hammer this idea home. The two most important things when it comes to creating an image are not how expensive your lens is, or how expensive your camera is, or your brand, or whether you got a white lens or a black lens or whatever it is. It's your light and it's your composition. A lot of people, if you go to online discussion forums, they think that you have to have an expensive camera to take great pictures, or you have to have the most expensive Zeiss glass or Canon glass in order to get it. No, if you don't have your light and composition down, this glass isn't going to mean anything. You're going to see this graph many times throughout the day, because I'm going to be hammering this core point. Light and composition are all you need. If you have them, you can get great shots even with a point and shoot. You know what camera I carry with me most of the time? Most of the time? RX100. Best point and shoot ever made. Up until now. What year is this? 2014? Yeah. I'm saying it for the benefit of the video. It's a point and shoot. The camera you have with you is much more valuable than the big expensive one you left home because it was too big and heavy to schlep with you. To drill in the idea that light and composition are more important than anything else, let me go over some historical pictures which were technically inferior, and yet they had a lasting impact worldwide because these all made headlines at one time or another. Who can tell me what that shot was? Tiananmen Square. 10 extra points if you know the year. 1989. 1989, very good. Now, I read the story about the photographer who took this. He was on a balcony in Beijing overlooking Tiananmen Square. He was shooting with a Canon AE1 in manual exposure mode. It was overexposed by about 2 stops. Every time he sees this picture, he cringes because it was overexposed. He had to bring it out in the darkroom. He tried to save it technically. It's a horrible shot technically, and yet it made headlines around the world. Lesson number 1, if your composition's compelling, technical stuff isn't quite as important. More examples reinforcing the same point. Who can tell me what the left image is? Hindenburg. Now that's a difficult exposure. Later on today, we're going to learn about brightest, darkest, and how much dynamic range your camera can actually see. So you had really, really bright highlights and really, really dark shadows. And the highlights blew out, and the shadows were no detail in them. And if you show that picture on one of the popular photography forums online, they're going to just tear that picture apart. Technically, it's horrible, but it made headlines, and really that's the best any photographer could have done, exposure-wise. The right image is? Or the photographer's hand, the photographer's buddy going like this out of the water. Nobody knows. Technically inferior, a world-changing shot. And one last example. This is a very famous one taken on D-Day. The war was over. This one made the cover of Life magazine. And if you look at it very carefully on the right, you probably can't see it because it's being drowned out by the lights, but it's out of focus. A little bit. Nobody cares. It was a compelling image. You get the idea. Image, composition, light, those are more important than all the technical stuff. So there's a little known truth about cameras. Most people think the camera is designed to make the picture look the way it looks to your eyes. But it's actually technically impossible because your eyes can see this much light from here over to here. A wide range of light, about 10 to the 30th stops. But your camera can only see about this much. About 8 stops, maybe 10, depending on your camera. Big difference. And before I talk more about that, let me just show you a couple of examples where light looked perfectly good to my eye, and yet it looked awful to the camera. This is a church shot in Boston, and it looked really, really good to my eye. That's how the camera picked it up. Now, who can tell me what magic button I pressed on my camera to go from that shot to this shot?
Auto exposure mode.
I heard someone say auto exposure mode.
Auto exposure lock.
Auto exposure lock. That's one good guess. Anybody else?
PVH,
Exposure compensation. That's a good guess. And
HDR.
HDR. Excellent guesses. Let me tell you what I actually did. I came back at a different time of day. When the light was better. Similar example. Both of these look really good to my eye, but they will look really, really different to the camera because, again, the camera can only see that much and your eye can see this much. All cinematographers and directors understand this. And that's why, has anybody ever seen a movie shot, on a set or even outside in the street? What do they do? What do they do? They have huge lights. Lots of lights, and if you ever see the actors, they look really, really well lit, but when you get inside the theater to see the same scene, how does it look? Perfectly normal. Because the cinematographers understand that film can see this much, and so they light the scene so that the brightest part is over here, and the darkest part is over here. And so it looks normal to you. Don't need any fancy HDR stuff. They can do everything they need with the light. Now, these shots were taken 2 minutes apart. What did I do to go from the left shot to the right shot?
Walked around the other side.
Yes, I walked around to the other side, where the light was. There's somebody always in the audience that says, "You switched to a Zeiss lens."
Yeah.
Zeiss lenses will not save you from bad light. I'm sorry. Yeah, you walk to the other side. The sky is blue, the light is good. It looked fine to my eye on the left, but you have to be aware of the light that's good for the camera in order to get the really good light to make people say, wow, good light is a key ingredient. A couple more examples. Here and here. Left one was an impossible situation, but I was able to conquer it. You know how? I did not tell the monkey to move. I came back on a different day. I had to. If I was a working photographer, which I am, and I had to sell the shot, otherwise I don't eat, which I do, light like that, you simply cannot make it work. You have to come back when the background isn't so blown out with white and the light's facing the monkey. So I had the luxury of coming back a different day and I got the shot. But there's nothing I can do, even my very expensive multi-$1,000 camera, to go from that to that in camera. You have to have the right light. Now, I know someone's in the audience saying, well, what about spot metering? Because somebody always asks this. Here's a backlit building, also in Boston. Come back on a different day, the light's better, the sky is blue. Which shot would you buy if you were a photo editor? You'd probably buy the middle one. Okay, now everyone asks me, what about spot metering? Can't you tell your camera to only focus on the light in the very, very center? If you turn your camera on spot metering, that's how it looks. Now, between the three of them, if you were the photo editor, which one would you buy? The middle one. There's no fancy setting on your camera that can save you from bad light. Come back on a different day. What's spot metering? I hear a couple people ask. Let me hook up the camera to the projector and show you what's going on. And if you just keep your camera in automatic mode, it'll try to average everything together. So you got a blown out window, and you got a chair which is decently exposed. Now, spot metering. Most high-end cameras have it, and you can select your metering mode. They all have a different user interface, but they all pretty much have the same feature. Here's our metering mode. This goes from intelligent, which really does work well most of the time. And we'll get into the details and the differences tomorrow. Metering mode is multi-segment, center, and spot metering. Spot metering, it only pays attention in the very, very center. You see that circle right in the middle? It's only paying attention to the light there, and ignores everything else outside the circle. So if I want to expose to the chair, I just point it to the chair, and the chair is pretty well exposed, and it's completely ignoring how bright the lamp is. And if I were to move it right below the light, it's still not effective with the light. But as soon as I fill that circle with the light, what's it doing? It's darkening it. It's making things, letting in less light to make this thing look like a normal exposure. What's actually happening is this is what the camera can see. And this string here represents the darkest and the brightest that is available in nature. Obviously, this is not to scale. But as your camera, as your spot meter, goes into a dark room, it starts to let in a lot of light so that things look normal. It's a dark room, so you have to let in more light. And as you point it to the bright light, it says, oh, that's a lot of light. I'm going to let in less light, like this, and optimize it for a bright day, because that's what it sees inside the spot. And you can see it actually happening. As I go from dark to light, you can see the exposure get darker. There's the chair. Okay, I'm going to move it over to the light. Now watch what the camera does. It starts to get darker immediately. Not immediately. It takes about a second. That's what's happening. That ruler is sliding from left to right. It's adjusting to it. Now notice that anything with this pink ruler, the way the exposure works is anything to the right of this looks blown out, completely white, washed out. Anything to the left of it is perfectly black, silhouetted. So if you want a silhouette on purpose, you have to make sure your shadow's over here. And you want to make sure, like there's a sun in the picture, you have to make sure the sun is over there. I'll show you some examples of that in just a minute. But the important thing is, through a combination of variables, it is going to try to slide that pink ruler from left to right to accommodate the 8 stops that it's able to see. And it can't see everything. It can either expose for the window or it can expose the chair, but it cannot do both. If that were a real window with trees outside and a beautiful blue sky, it would show up washed out just like this. A camera cannot record both dark and light at the same time. And it's done this way intentionally. I'll show you an example of this in just a moment. So that's how spot metering works. If you have a difficult situation like this one, it's designed so that you'll be exposing for the subject you want and ignoring the background that you don't want. But as you can see with these examples, it's better to have good light to begin with. So this is a nice diagram. So when you're going through the handouts 10, 20, 30 years from now, you're going to be reminded of this pink ruler moving against this scale. The amount of light that exists in the real world is represented by the red line. The human eye can see a little bit less than that. By the way, this is not the scale. This is a gross exaggeration, but it gets the idea across pretty well. Your camera can see about that much, a small sliver of what's available in the real world. That's what your camera can do. Digital sensors are a little bit narrower. Photographic paper is even narrower still. So even if you're shot with color negative film or you're shot with a digital film, it captures more information than you can print. That's an important thing to know. If your goal is to be print, you have to make sure that your brightest part is no more than 6 stops away from your darkest part. Again, if you're a cinematographer, you are trained from birth to think this way. If you're a normal person, none of this is obvious. So this explains a couple things, which I said earlier. The first thing it explains is why the picture looked fine to you, even though it shows up as a silhouette on the camera. What did I do to get these silhouettes? And by the way, I pre-visualized the image. I knew I wanted a silhouette. And I didn't want to put the camera on automatic because I didn't want to leave anything to chance. What I did was I spot metered for the sky. Knowing that if you put your metering here, in this case you meter for the sky, anything to the right of the ruler is going to be blown out white, like the sun. Anything to the left of it is going to be pure black, a silhouette. And you can intentionally place the ruler here or here to get the effect that you want. I wanted a silhouette. I wanted my subject to be here, to the left. And that's how I did it for both of these shots. You can take advantage of the fact that the camera has a lower dynamic range than your eye does and make some artistic things. That's one explanation. The other explanation explains why you need a flash in places where you can see just fine. Because the camera can't. Your eyes are better than the camera. And also, as I mentioned a second ago, when you're seeing a Hollywood movie being made, they use really big lights to make things look perfectly normal by the time you hit the theater. Because they understand the narrower dynamic range of the film, and they can light their scenes accordingly to make sure it looks good. So, a lot of you may ask, well, if there's this much light in the real world, and your eye can see this much light, can't you build a sensor that can see as much light as the real world? Can't you build a sensor that can see what the eye can see? And the answer is yes. We can, but we don't do it. And here's why. If you were to do that, this is an example. I was able to simulate that using what I call extremely high HDR. I took like 20 different pictures of this scene, and in this scene we have brightness outside of the windows, with bright outside. And we also had detail in the darkest shadows underneath the piano. That's a very, very wide dynamic range scene, and I was able to take 20 different pictures, each a different exposure, about 1 stop apart, and then I merged them all in Photoshop, so make sure that you don't lose any details in the shadows, and to make sure that the highlights don't get burned out. And it looks like that. It looks flat, it looks low contrast, it looks awful. Why then can our eyes see so much light and make it look not like that? The answer is our brain is doing some kind of cognitive analysis that nobody quite understands yet. But it's doing something to reduce this to about 6 stops. This drove George Eastman nuts when he was developing the photographic industry. Because he knew there's this much light, but it didn't look normal unless you reduce the dynamic range of the film and the print to about 6 stops. You lose your detail in the shadows, but everything else looked right. And that's how they evolved, that's how they arrived at the standard that we see now, about 6 to 8 stops. And that hasn't changed. A lot of people try to do HDR. Does anybody here have a camera that can do high dynamic range built right in? You do? And when you take those pictures out in the field and look at them on your computer, do they look wow or do they look really flat? They look flat.
I haven't played with it that much.
Haven't played with it that much. If you did, you'll decide that these are flat and lifeless, and you have to do another step in Photoshop manually called tone mapping. Your camera cannot do it for you. As soon as somebody figures out what goes on in our brain to reduce 30 stops to 8 to make it look normal, the camera will do it too. Then we won't need this pink ruler thing, and a camera will actually be able to capture what your eye sees. Until that time, you have to be aware that there's only a 6-stop range, and that you have to make sure that the light is right for that, so it looks good in the camera. Something difficult to do. From now on, as you go outside, and you guys, before you even pick up your camera, the first thing you have to ask yourself is the light good? Is this going to look good for my camera? I've been on several times of trips where the light wasn't good. I don't even pick my camera up. There's no point. It's not going to be a wow shot. I won't be able to sell it. So, I just said this. Be aware of light. This is your new commandment now that you've taken this seminar. Before you pick up your camera, ask yourself, is the light right for my camera? Just because it looks good to you doesn't mean it's going to be a wow shot. Light will make the difference. Not a fancy camera, not an expensive lens, not a fancy HDR feature. You don't have good light, forget it. More examples of waiting for the right light. We were in New York City once. Now again, I'm in a unique position because if I don't sell my pictures, I don't eat. So I have to make sure that my pictures are a little bit better than anybody else's. To get that little extra oomph, sometimes I have to go to unusual lengths to make mine a little bit better so it'll get selected. Here we were in New York City. It was a very cloudy day, as you can see, and there was a hole in the clouds, which was slowly going over the city. I took my first picture. I noticed that the less interesting building was the one that was illuminated, and I said to myself, you know, if I stand here for 10 minutes, that hole in the cloud might just go over the important part of my composition, this building here. And I waited 10 minutes, and sure enough, I got it. So I made the picture maybe 5% better. But you have to be willing to go to an unusual length to make the picture a little bit better. Oh, I have more examples. This one's a little bit more extreme. If I were a tourist, the first time I saw the Petronas Towers in Malaysia, it was in an afternoon on a blah day, and I took the shot because that's what you do. You know, you may not ever get another chance. So I just took the shot to cover my bases. But then I came back later on that night, and two things happened. One, the intensity of the sky lowered as sunset happened. Two, the building started to light itself. So the light on the subject came up, the backlight came down, and when the two of them were just about equal, that's the time you want to shoot. So I came back and I got that shot. That's a marketable shot. But it all comes down to waiting for the right light to be, because there's nothing you can do with your really expensive multi-$1,000 camera to make the left shot as good as the right shot, other than coming back when the light is better. Am I getting my point across that light is more important than anything else? You're going to walk out of here and say, light, 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 light. And that's exactly what I want you to do. This is another example of exactly the same thing. Same shot of a hotel. One was taken in the afternoon. As you can see, it was a bright, overcast day, and my camera was fooled by the light in the sky. It says, oh my gosh, look at all that light. I'm going to let in less to make sure the picture looks normal. So it was thrown off by the intensity of the sky. And the beautiful hotel came out looking kind of drab. What did I do? Later on in the day, the intensity of the sky got lower, because that's what it does in your sunset, and the building lit itself up. So the background came down, the foreground was lit. When the two matched, I got a beautiful shot. Coming back at the right time of day will make a difference between a sellable shot and a snapshot that you will admire 30 years from now, but nobody else will. Now, there's a story associated with this one. I was on my honeymoon. My wife had never been married to a photographer before. We were in Alaska, we got a beautiful shot, and I said to her, you know, if we stayed here for an hour and a half, the sun will go down, you'll get a beautiful reds in the sky and the clouds, it'll be a much nicer shot. Two impressive things happened. One, we actually waited for an hour and a half on my honeymoon. Two, we're still married. Quality of light can make the difference between a snapshot and an emotional shot. And again, cinematographers know this better than anybody else. If they want to have a tear-jerker movie, they want to light the characters a certain way. You can create emotion by manipulating your light a little bit. These two shots were taken about 2 minutes apart. The first one was taken with a pop-up flash on my camera. And it looks like it was taken with a pop-up flash on my camera. Pop-up flash is the worst kind of light you can ever get. Worst. If it's a sole source of light in a dark room. Instead, I put a wireless flash outside the window with an umbrella and an orange filter. So it looked like a sunrise. I could use a small f-stop, and the light coming from the side really makes an emotional impact on it. Now, you don't have to go to the lengths that I went to get the same kind of thing. The takeaway from this is, if your light is something other than the pop-up flash, if your light is ambient, if it's light coming from anywhere but the front of your lens, it's going to be a better, more interesting, more compelling shot. And let's talk also about the difference between harsh light and soft light. Many of you know this already. If you're taking a portrait of someone, which is better, on an overcast day or on a really bright day with no clouds and the sun shining overhead? Overcast. Why is that? Softer light. And what people mean by softer light is, look at the shadows. Harsh light will create very harsh shadows where things are, and soft light kind of feathers the shadow a little bit. It looks much more pleasing for portraits. You just have to make sure you don't get the sky in your picture also, because the sky will be bright, it'll be white, it'll be a blown out background, it'll ruin your shot. If you make sure it's not in the picture, it can illuminate your subject very, very nicely. Sometimes the best kind of light you can get is from a north-facing window inside. And I was going to actually give you a demonstration of this inside this very theater, but there are no windows in this theater. But what I want to do is give you one more point about quality of light and what makes for a great portrait. There is something called, I just said this, so this is for your edification 30 years from now. Some of the best portraits can be had if light is coming from the side of a person, like that, and the light on the bright side of the person is twice as strong as the light on the dark side of the person. The official term for this is called 2-to-1 lighting ratio, which means the bright light is twice as strong as the less bright light. The ratio is 2-to-1. It's difficult for the eye to know when things are 2-to-1 lighting ratio, because 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 8-to-1, 16-to-1, they all look the same to the eye. The camera can tell the difference. How is it possible then for you to get really good 2-to-1 lighting and know that you got the right lighting before you pick up the camera without having to experiment? The answer is a gift I'm going to give you now. This is a tool for evaluating good portrait light. Let me hand these out now. Give me a minute. So let me just kind of break in here and explain how to use the gray card. You have a PDF file that came, which you can download. And if you don't have a two-sided printer, just print out one big square and then fold it over. On the back, we'll have instructions on how to use it in case you forget. And on the front, you've got two squares. One is exactly twice as dark as the other. And here's how to use it. Fold the piece of paper till it's about 90 degrees, like that. And get yourself a nice model, and in an area which is open shade, not direct sunlight. To get 2-to-1 lighting ratio, what you want to do is hold this in front of your model and move it around until the two squares appear to your eye to be the same intensity, right about there. If the light hitting the dark side is twice as bright as the light hitting the light side, they will appear to your eye as being the same intensity. So right about there is what works for me. And let's take a shot and see how it looks. And here we go. And let's take one more. And this time, why don't you hold that one right up so the folks at home can see pretty much how the intensity looks. Right there. Good. One more. Good. Beautiful, huh?
Very.
Very. Thank you.